This video is on our last topic for Unit 6, which is solving equations by factoring polynomials. We've already learned all of the different ways to factor polynomials. For instance, the AC method, finding factors of C that add to B, the difference of two squares. But now we're going to solve equations that involve having to use these factoring techniques. The first thing we need to know is the zero product property. If I was to multiply two numbers together, and let's say I didn't know what one of them was, so 2 times some number x, and it equaled 0. Well, what do we know? We know divided by 2, x equals 0. We know that the only way to get 0 when two numbers multiply is that one of the numbers has to be 0. So the zero product property says that if two numbers or variables a times b equals 0, then either a has to be equal to 0 or b has to be equal to 0. So if a times b equals 0, we know that either a is 0 or b is 0. Looking at an example, we have the factor x minus 8 times the factor x plus 1 equals 0. If I was given an equation like this, I would know that either x minus 8 had to equal 0 or x plus 1 had to equal 0 based off of the zero product property. This is because one of these has to be equal to 0 because any number times 0 is 0. So if we know this, we know that we can add 8 to both sides and get x equals 8, or we can subtract 1 from both sides and get x equals negative 1. Therefore, I know my possible values of x are negative 1 or 8. And if we plug this back in to check, we see that, negative 1 minus 8 times negative 1 plus 1 is going to equal 0. Well, negative 1 minus 8 is negative 9, but negative 1 plus 1 is 0, and negative 9 times 0 is 0 equals 0. So that works. The same thing would happen if you plugged in 8. We're now going to apply that to a normal equation like x squared minus 4x equals negative 3. So let's write that out. X squared minus 4x equals negative 3. You're given an equation like this, and you're asked to find what x equals. Well, our goal is to get it into two factors so that we can set each factor equal to 0, like we saw on the last slide. All right, step 1. I want you to set the equation equal to 0 by adding or subtracting on one side. What this means is that we want this entire equation to actually equal 0, not negative 3. So we're going to bring everything to one side in order to get that. It's easier to move one term instead of two, so I would get rid of this negative 3 rather than trying to move this stuff to the other side. So the opposite of subtraction is addition, so we're going to add 3. And you're going to see that I have x squared minus 4x plus 3 equals 0, because none of these can combine like terms to simplify. So step 2 is to put in standard form. Now remember, standard form. Standard form is the exponents going from greatest to least. So in this case, my polynomial is already in descending order. But in case it hadn't been, you need to rewrite it that way. Otherwise, you will not factor correctly. Speaking of which, step 3 is to factor the polynomial. So since this is a trinomial where a is equal to 1 we're going to look for the factors of c, which is 3, that add to negative 4. So factors of 3, 1 and 3, or negative 1 and negative 3. Well, 1 plus 3 equals 4. Negative 1 plus negative 3 is negative 4. So obviously, we want these. These are our two factors. Therefore, we're going to have x minus 1 times x minus 3, which equals 0. Finally, step 4 is set each factor equal to 0 and solve for x. So what this means is we're next going to set each factor equal to 0. So x minus 1 equals 0, x minus 3 equals 0, and then I'm going to solve each equation for x. I'm going to add 1. Sorry, I've run out of space here. So x equals 1, or I'm going to add 3, and x equals 3. Therefore, my solutions to this equation are x equals 1 and x equals 3. And we can check our answer by plugging back in. So what's important is you just have to remember the steps. Step 1, set the equation equal to 0 by adding or subtracting. You just want to move all of the stuff on one side to the other so that you have nothing on one side. You have 0. Step 2, put in standard form if it's not already in it. Step 3, factor. Step 4, set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So looking at this equation, 5x plus x squared minus 6 equals 0, I want you to pause the video and try this on your own. Okay, first thing we want to do is set the equation equal to 0. Well, it's already been done for us, so we can skip that step. Step 2 is to put the polynomial in standard form. Well, I want it in descending order, so x squared will come first, plus 5x minus 6 equals 0. Step 3 is to factor. I'm looking for factors of negative 6 that add to 5. Well, I have 6 and negative 1, or negative 6 and positive 1. 6 minus 1 is 5, so I want x plus 6 times x minus 1 equals 0. Finally, we're going to set each factor equal to 0 and then solve for x. So here I'm going to take away 6 and I get x equals negative 6. Here I'm going to add 1 and get x equals 1. So my final answers are x equals 1 and negative 6. If you got that, nice job. I think you're starting to get this. All right, if we look at this equation, 3x squared plus 3 equals 6x. I'm first going to subtract 6x from both sides, and I'm going to have 3x squared minus 6x plus 3 equals 0. It's in standard form, so I don't have to worry about that. But now I'm going to factor. And what's the first thing we always do when we factor? Hopefully you're saying to yourself, find the GCF, because that would be correct. So the GCF of this is 3, and I'm left with x squared minus 3x, excuse me, nope. 6 divided by 3 is minus 2x plus 1 equals 0. Now, we know that this is 3 times this polynomial of x squared minus 2x plus 1. So to get rid of multiplication, we can divide. And we're going to get, these are going to cancel out. We get x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 0, because 0 divided by 3 is 0. Finally, we're going to factor x minus 1 times x minus 1 equals 0, and x minus 1 equals 0, add 1, and we get x equals 1. So, what's important is if we have a GCF that's a number, we can divide by the GCF and kind of simplify our polynomial. Otherwise, if we had factored this, we would have to do the AC method and it would be a lot more difficult. Looking at this equation, we have x cubed minus 2x squared minus 8x equals 0. So step 1 was to set the equation equal to 0. Check, that's already done. Step 2 is to put it into standard form. 3, 2, 1, that's already done. Step 3 is to factor, and we always look for the GCF first, and we happen to have a GCF of x. That gives us x squared minus 2x minus 8 equals 0. Now on the last problem, we divided by the GCF to make things simpler, but we cannot divide by a variable. It's one of those golden rules, don't divide by a variable, never do that. So we kind of have to leave the GCF there for now, and let's just focus on x squared minus 2x minus 8. So I'm looking for factors of negative 8 that add to negative 2. Hopefully you're thinking 4 and positive 2. So we have x on the outside, and then x minus 4 times x plus 2 equals 0. Well, the last step was to set each factor equal to 0. But now we have 3 factors. We have our usual x minus 4 and x plus 2, but we also have x here on the outside. You can think of it as a set of parentheses on its own. So we have to set that equal to 0, along with x minus 4 equals 0 and x plus 2 equals 0. X equals 0 is already solved, so we know one of our solutions is going to be 0. Here I'm going to add 4 and get x equals 4, so that's going to be another solution. And here I'm going to subtract 2 and get x equals negative 2, and that's going to be our final solution. So in this particular problem, we're going to have 3 solutions here. X equals negative 2, 0, and 4. The lesson to learn here is always, and I would write this down if I were you, factor out a GCF first, which we already know, first. If the GCF is a number only, divide both sides by the GCF, by that number. If the GCF has a variable, don't divide. Set that as a factor equal to 0. So basically what we saw from the last 2 problems is that we got a GCF, and when we get to the factor the polynomial step, step 3, you want to factor out a GCF first. If the GCF is only a number, like we had 3 times a polynomial, divide both sides by the GCF so that everything's a little simpler for you. However, if the GCF has a variable, like we saw the GCF was x, you cannot divide because you can't divide by a variable. So set that as another factor equal to 0, along with the other factors you get from factoring the remaining polynomial. Okay, looking at one more problem. This is more of an application question. You're given a square. One side is x squared plus 48, the other side is 14x. And the question's asking for 2 possible values of x. Well, what do we know about a square? Hopefully you're saying, well, a square has 4 equal sides. That means this side is equal to this side, which is equal to the length of this side, which is equal to this side. So we know x squared plus 48 equals 14x. Well, I want to find what x is, so I need to solve this equation. I'm going to subtract by 14x first, and I'm going to put that in standard form. So x squared minus 14x plus 48 equals 0. I'd like you to pause the video and try this problem on your own. Okay, hopefully you've tried this. Now let's check to see if you're right. I'm looking for factors of 48 that add to negative 14, and that's negative 8 and negative 6. So x minus 8 times x minus 6 equals 0. Therefore, x minus 8 equals 0. I can add 8 and get x equals 8. I also know x minus 6 equals 0. So I can add 6 and get x equals 6. Therefore, my two possible values of x are x equals 6 and x equals 8. And you can plug those back in. So 6 squared is 36, and 36 plus 48 is 74. Well, 14 times 6 is also 74. You'll see the same thing happen with 8. So my recommendation is just to get comfortable with this by practicing, but hopefully this covers everything you need to know about solving equations by factoring polynomials.